What happens to justice and to childhood when a nation is an island and the island is a family? Picture this: a volcanic rock jutting from the Pacific Ocean, so remote it takes 4 days by ship to reach the nearest major port. No airport, no harbor suitable for large vessels, just 47 souls living in a community where nearly everyone shares DNA traced back to 9 British mutineers and their Polynesian partners from 1790. This is Pitcairn Island, the world's smallest democracy, where the mayor's house sits walking distance from every other building on the 2-mile stretch of inhabitable land. But in September 2004, this isolated paradise became the stage for one of the most shocking legal proceedings in British colonial history. International investigators had arrived with warrants, and the charges they brought would shake this tiny community to its core. A third of the island's adult men, including Fletcher Christian, the sitting mayor and direct descendant of bounty mutineer Fletcher Christian, faced 55 counts of sexual offenses against girls and women spanning 3 decades. The allegations weren't just numerous, they were systematic. Multiple victims, some as young as 10 years old, describing patterns of abuse that had allegedly been normalized within the island's closed society. When the truth emerged, it would force British courts to grapple with a fundamental constitutional question: what law governs an island founded by mutineers, and who has the authority to enforce justice when everyone knows everyone, and silence has become survival? The numbers alone were staggering. In a community of fewer than 50 people, 7 men faced charges, including 21 counts of rape, 41 of indecent assault, and 2 of gross indecency with children under 14. Mayor Fletcher Christian, born in 1951 and the island's leader since 1999, was charged with 6 rapes and 4 indecent assaults, allegedly committed between 1964 and 1975, when some victims were barely entering their teens. His son, Randy Christian, faced similar charges. Dave Brown, Dennis Christian, Len Brown, Jay Warren, and Terry Young completed the list of defendants, representing bloodlines that traced directly back to the original bounty mutineers. This isn't just the story of Operation Unique, as investigators codenamed their inquiry. It's about what happens when isolation breeds impunity, when cultural traditions collide with universal human rights, and when the mythology of a romantic castaway paradise crumbles under the weight of documented evidence. The investigation had been triggered in 1999, when a 15-year-old girl decided to press rape charges, setting in motion a legal process that would ultimately expose what prosecutors described as a culture of systematic sexual abuse stretching back generations. The legal documents, court transcripts, and witness testimonies that emerged would reveal a community where reporting abuse meant facing social exile, where victims were silenced by family ties that literally connected everyone to everyone else, and where the line between tradition and criminal behavior had been deliberately blurred for generations. Police officers from Kent and New Zealand authorities spent 2 years gathering evidence, interviewing victims who had emigrated to Australia and New Zealand, and building cases that would challenge the very foundations of how justice operates in Britain's most remote territory. What made this case unprecedented wasn't just the allegations, it was the jurisdiction. Pitcairn Island operates under a unique constitutional arrangement as a British overseas territory, governed by laws that ultimately trace back to London, but administered locally by an island council with significant autonomy. The defense would argue that British law didn't apply to their ancient community, that their customs and traditions predated modern legal systems, and that London had no authority to prosecute crimes on an island that had governed itself for over 2 centuries. Before we dive into this complex story of justice delayed but not denied, I want you to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what state or country you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue investigating these forgotten stories that mainstream media often overlooks. Stay with me until the end to understand how Britain's highest courts finally answered the question that had protected Pitcairn's secrets for centuries. Can distance be a defense? And can tradition justify harm? The journey to justice would take years, cross multiple jurisdictions, and ultimately establish legal precedent that no corner of the British Empire, no matter how remote, exists beyond the reach of law. The Privy Council's final ruling in 2006 would settle not just the fate of 7 men, but the fundamental question of whether isolation grants immunity. But first, we need to understand how this tiny speck in the Pacific became a place where such systematic abuse could allegedly flourish unchecked for 3 decades, protected by bloodline loyalty and the silence that comes when your abuser is also your mayor, your relative, and one of the few people standing between your family and complete social isolation. The case would ultimately reveal how geographical isolation and genetic isolation can create perfect conditions for systematic abuse to flourish. When your population consists of fewer than 50 people, when most adults are related by blood or marriage, when challenging authority means potential exile from the only community you've ever known, the normal safeguards that protect vulnerable people simply don't exist. Add to this the romantic mythology that surrounded Pitcairn, the story of noble mutineers finding paradise in the Pacific, and you have a perfect storm where abuse could be reframed as tradition, where silence could be presented as cultural preservation, and where victims could be isolated not just geographically, but socially, economically, and psychologically from any possibility of justice. The trials that began in September 2004 would force the world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that some of our most cherished stories about human nature, about isolated communities finding harmony through self-governance, about the romantic appeal of life beyond the reach of modern civilization, can mask systematic harm that persists precisely because it exists beyond the normal mechanisms of accountability and oversight. This is the story of how that silence was finally broken, and what it cost everyone involved. To understand how systematic abuse could allegedly persist for decades on Pitcairn Island, you first need to grasp the unique geographical and social conditions that make this place unlike anywhere else on Earth. Pitcairn Island sits in the South Pacific Ocean, roughly midway between New Zealand and South America, at coordinates that place it among the most isolated inhabited places on the planet. The nearest populated land is the Gambier Islands, 330 miles away. The nearest major port is in New Zealand, over 3,300 miles distant, a journey that takes 4 days by ship, assuming you can find a vessel willing to make the trek. There is no airport, no regular ferry service, no cruise ship dock. Supply runs happen 3 to 4 times per year, weather permitting. When investigators arrived in 2004 to conduct Operation Unique, they had to charter a specialized vessel and plan for extended stays, because leaving and returning wasn't a matter of booking a flight. The island itself measures just 2.2 miles long and 1.2 miles wide, with a total land area of 1.75 square miles. Most of the coastline consists of rugged cliffs rising directly from the ocean, leaving only one small harbor area called Bounty Bay, where boats can land in calm conditions. The entire inhabited area consists of Adamstown, the world's smallest capital city, population varying between 40 and 50, depending on births, deaths, and the occasional emigrant seeking opportunities elsewhere. This geographical isolation has profound social implications. Unlike urban communities where anonymity provides protection, where multiple institutions provide oversight, where victims can seek help from strangers who have no personal investment in maintaining existing power structures, Pitcairn operates as what sociologists call a closed system. Everyone knows everyone's business. Privacy is virtually impossible. Social networks are identical to family networks, which are identical to economic networks, which are identical to political networks. The genetic foundation of this closed system traces back to April 1789, when 9 mutineers from HMS Bounty arrived with 6 Polynesian men and 12 Polynesian women. This founding population of 27 people would become the ancestors of virtually everyone who has ever lived on Pitcairn. By 2004, when the trials began, genetic analysis showed that the entire population descended from just 4 family lines: Christian, Warren, Brown, and Young. These weren't just common surnames. They represented actual bloodline connections that linked nearly every resident to nearly every other resident through a complex web of cousin relationships spanning multiple generations. Population geneticists have a term for this phenomenon: the founder effect. When a small group establishes an isolated population, their genetic and cultural characteristics become amplified in subsequent generations, simply because there are so few alternative influences. On Pitcairn, this effect was extreme. Research documented in peer-reviewed journals shows that the average coefficient of relatedness between islanders was significantly higher than what you'd find in typical communities, approaching levels more commonly seen in indigenous populations that had been isolated for centuries rather than decades. But the founder effect isn't just genetic. It's cultural. The social norms, power structures, and behavioral patterns established by those original 27 settlers became the template for all subsequent generations. If the founders normalized certain behaviors, if they established certain hierarchies, if they created certain definitions of acceptable conduct, those patterns would be reinforced generation after generation simply because there were no external influences to challenge or modify them. Governance on Pitcairn reflects this reality. The island operates as a British overseas territory under the Pitcairn Constitution, which grants significant autonomy to the Island Council while maintaining ultimate British sovereignty. The council consists of 4 elected members plus the island magistrate, who serves as both judge and administrative head. The mayor, also elected, serves as the political leader and representative to the outside world. In practice, these positions have historically been held by members of the same extended family networks, creating a situation where political authority, judicial authority, economic control, and social leadership were concentrated within the same small group of related individuals. This concentration of power had practical implications for anyone seeking to challenge the status quo. Filing a complaint against the mayor meant challenging someone who controlled not just political decisions, but also access to the supply ship, allocation of land use permits, employment opportunities, and social standing within the community. Filing a complaint against a family patriarch meant potentially alienating multiple extended family members who controlled various aspects of daily life. In a community where social exile meant practical exile, where there were no alternative social networks, no independent economic opportunities, no way to remain on the island while avoiding someone you'd accused, the barriers to reporting abuse were insurmountable. These structural problems were compounded by practical isolation from outside legal and social services. The nearest police station was 3,300 miles away in New Zealand. The nearest hospital, social worker, counseling service, or independent legal advisor was equally distant. When abuse occurred on Pitcairn, victims had no realistic access to the support systems that enable reporting and prosecution in typical communities. They couldn't call a hotline, visit a clinic, or speak confidentially with trained professionals who had no personal connections to their abusers. Instead, they lived in a community where their abusers were also their relatives, neighbors, employers, and political leaders, where reporting abuse meant risking not just personal retaliation, but community-wide ostracism that could affect multiple generations of family members, where the people who might serve as witnesses to their experiences were often related to their abusers and had their own reasons for maintaining silence, where the very remoteness and insularity that attracted romantic attention from the outside world created perfect conditions for systematic harm to persist, undetected and unchallenged for decades. By 2004, when Operation Unique investigators arrived, they would discover that these structural conditions had indeed enabled patterns of alleged abuse spanning multiple decades and involving multiple generations of victims and perpetrators. The geographical isolation that made Pitcairn seem like paradise had also made it a place where normal safeguards against systematic abuse simply didn't exist, and where breaking the silence would require external intervention from authorities who had the power to enforce accountability, regardless of family ties, social pressure, and the practical difficulties of life in the world's most remote community. The first crack in Pitcairn's wall of silence came from an unexpected source: a 15-year-old girl who made a decision that would ultimately expose decades of alleged systematic abuse. In 1999, this young woman chose to press rape charges, setting in motion a legal process that would take 5 years to fully unfold and would ultimately involve police officers from multiple countries, victims scattered across the Pacific, and evidence spanning 3 decades of alleged criminal activity. The initial report triggered what investigators would later codename Operation Unique, a reference both to the unprecedented nature of prosecuting serious crimes on the world's most isolated, inhabited island, and to the unique legal and logistical challenges of gathering evidence in a place where normal investigative procedures simply couldn't apply. The operation would involve police officers from Kent, England, working alongside New Zealand authorities, conducting interviews on 3 different continents, and ultimately building cases that would challenge fundamental assumptions about jurisdiction, cultural autonomy, and the reach of British law. What investigators discovered during their preliminary inquiries was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The 15-year-old's report wasn't an isolated incident. It was the tip of an iceberg that extended back generations. As police officers began conducting confidential interviews with current and former Pitcairn residents, a pattern emerged that would ultimately encompass multiple alleged victims, multiple perpetrators, and a time frame stretching from the 1960s through the 1990s. The scale of the allegations was particularly shocking, given Pitcairn's tiny population. In a community that had never exceeded 50 people during the relevant time period, investigators documented claims involving at least 13 alleged victims and 7 alleged perpetrators. This meant that a significant percentage of the island's adult men were accused of sexual offenses, and a significant percentage of the island's women had allegedly been victimized. The mathematical reality was stark. In such a small community, these patterns of abuse would have been impossible to hide from other residents, which raised uncomfortable questions about community complicity and the normalization of behavior that would be clearly criminal in any other context. The investigation faced unique challenges from the beginning. Many of the alleged victims had emigrated to Australia or New Zealand over the years, pursuing educational or economic opportunities unavailable on Pitcairn. This diaspora meant that witness interviews had to be conducted across multiple jurisdictions, with investigators traveling thousands of miles to speak with individuals who had left the island decades earlier, but retained vivid memories of their childhood experiences. These interviews revealed disturbing patterns. Multiple witnesses described similar experiences: approaches by older male relatives or authority figures, escalation to sexual contact, and implicit or explicit warnings about the consequences of reporting such encounters. Several alleged victims reported being told that such behavior was normal on Pitcairn, that it was part of growing up in their community, and that outsiders wouldn't understand their unique cultural traditions. Perhaps most chillingly, several witnesses described a community-wide culture of silence that made reporting abuse practically impossible. In interviews conducted under strict confidentiality, former residents described Pitcairn as a place where challenging any adult authority figure, particularly male authority figures from prominent families, was simply not done. Where children learned early that family loyalty trumped personal safety, where community cohesion was maintained by avoiding topics that might create conflict or division. As the investigation progressed, investigators documented evidence of what appeared to be systematic grooming and normalization of abuse. Multiple witnesses described similar patterns: older men in positions of authority using their status to gain access to younger victims, gradually escalating contact while framing it as education, tradition, or normal social interaction. The small size of the community meant that these men often held multiple roles. They might serve as political leaders, employers, and family patriarchs simultaneously, giving them enormous leverage over potential victims and their families. The evidence-gathering process revealed another disturbing pattern: active suppression of complaints when they did arise. Several witnesses reported that previous attempts to raise concerns about inappropriate behavior had been dismissed, minimized, or redirected back to them as personal problems rather than community issues. Some described being told by other adults that they had misunderstood what had happened to them, that they were making trouble for their families, or that bringing such issues to the attention of outside authorities would result in harm to the entire community. This systematic suppression appeared to be reinforced by the practical realities of island life. Witnesses described how challenging an authority figure could result in economic retaliation, loss of employment, denial of access to community resources, or social isolation that made day-to-day life extremely difficult. In a community where cooperation was essential for survival, where everyone depended on everyone else for everything from transportation to medical emergencies, maintaining social harmony often required accepting unacceptable behavior from those in power. The investigation also uncovered evidence of what appeared to be intergenerational patterns of abuse. Several witnesses reported that the same men who had allegedly victimized them as children were later in positions to victimize their own children or other children in the next generation. The closed nature of Pitcairn's social system meant that predatory behavior, once established and normalized, could persist across multiple generations without effective intervention. By 2002, investigators had gathered sufficient evidence to warrant formal charges. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed testimony from multiple witnesses, examined documentary evidence including medical records and correspondence, and concluded that they had probable cause to proceed with prosecutions involving 7 men and 55 separate criminal charges. The charges included 21 counts of rape, 41 of indecent assault, and 2 of gross indecency with children under 14. The decision to proceed with prosecutions represented a watershed moment, not just for the alleged victims, but for Pitcairn's entire community. For the first time in the island's modern history, outside authorities were asserting jurisdiction over behavior that locals had either accepted, ignored, or actively concealed. The comfortable fiction that Pitcairn existed beyond the reach of external law was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. But even as investigators prepared to bring the machinery of British justice to this remote Pacific island, they faced unprecedented challenges. How do you conduct fair trials in a place where potential jurors are related to both victims and defendants? How do you ensure witness security when everyone lives within walking distance of everyone else? How do you enforce court orders on an island where the defendants include the mayor, the magistrate, and other community leaders essential to basic governmental functions? These questions would soon be answered as Operation Unique moved from investigation to prosecution, transforming Pitcairn Island from a romantic symbol of isolation and self-sufficiency into the stage for one of the most complex jurisdictional battles in modern British legal history. As Operation Unique moved from initial complaints to systematic investigation, the scope and complexity of the alleged crimes began to emerge through painstaking detective work conducted across multiple continents and spanning several decades of evidence. What investigators ultimately documented would challenge fundamental assumptions about how abuse operates in isolated communities and reveal the sophisticated mechanisms through which systematic harm had allegedly been normalized and perpetuated across multiple generations. The chronological scope of the allegations was staggering. Evidence presented to investigators suggested that patterns of sexual abuse had been occurring on Pitcairn Island continuously from at least the early 1960s through the late 1990s, a 30-year period encompassing multiple generations of victims and representing virtually the entire modern history of the island's community. Court documents would later show that the earliest alleged offenses dated to 1964, when some of the defendants were teenagers themselves, and continued through 1999, when the investigation was triggered by that 15-year-old girl's decision to press charges. This timeline revealed disturbing patterns of intergenerational transmission of abusive behavior. Investigators documented evidence suggesting that some of the men who faced charges as adults had themselves allegedly been involved in sexual activity as minors, creating cycles where victimization in one generation became perpetration in the next. The closed nature of Pitcairn's social system meant that these patterns could persist and evolve without external intervention or alternative models of appropriate behavior. The investigation methodology had to be adapted to Pitcairn's unique circumstances. Traditional police procedures assume access to forensic laboratories, medical facilities, independent witnesses, and documentary evidence maintained by neutral third parties. None of these resources existed on Pitcairn in any meaningful form. Instead, investigators had to rely heavily on witness testimony, personal documents, correspondence, and the kind of detailed pattern analysis typically reserved for cold case investigations where physical evidence has been lost or compromised. Detective work involved extensive travel and cultural sensitivity training. Police officers from Kent and New Zealand spent months learning about Pitcairn's unique social dynamics, family relationships, and cultural practices to better understand the context in which alleged crimes had occurred. They studied genealogical records to map family relationships, analyzed historical documents to understand power structures, and consulted with experts in isolated community dynamics to develop interview techniques appropriate for witnesses who had lived their entire lives in a closed social system. The victim interviews revealed consistent patterns that investigators found particularly compelling. Multiple witnesses, interviewed separately across different countries and time periods, described similar experiences with remarkable consistency in detail and emotional tone. They described similar approaches by perpetrators, similar settings where abuse allegedly occurred, similar warnings about the consequences of disclosure, and similar community responses when concerns were raised. These interviews also revealed the sophisticated methods allegedly used to normalize inappropriate behavior. Witnesses described how older men in positions of authority would gradually introduce sexual contact through what appeared to be education, tradition, or normal social interaction. They would frame their behavior as teaching young people about adult relationships, as preparing them for marriage, or as continuation of cultural practices that outsiders wouldn't understand. This normalization process made it difficult for victims to recognize that they were being harmed and created psychological barriers to seeking help or reporting abuse. The investigation uncovered evidence of what appeared to be systematic grooming practices adapted to Pitcairn's unique social environment. In typical communities, predators must work around institutions, social networks, and authority figures who might interfere with their access to victims. On Pitcairn, many of the alleged perpetrators were themselves the authority figures. They served as political leaders, employers, family patriarchs, and community decision-makers. This concentration of roles gave them enormous leverage over potential victims and their families, creating situations where resistance was practically impossible. Medical evidence was limited but suggestive. While detailed forensic examinations were impossible, given the time elapsed, and the limited medical facilities available on Pitcairn, investigators did obtain access to some medical records and historical documentation that provided corroborating evidence for witness testimony. These documents included treatment records for conditions consistent with sexual trauma, correspondence between island residents and outside medical professionals that referenced concerning behaviors, and official reports from various administrative visits that noted unusual social dynamics within the community. The documentary evidence also included personal correspondence, diaries, and other materials that provided insight into community attitudes toward sexuality, authority, and appropriate behavior. Some of these documents suggested that concerns about inappropriate sexual conduct had been raised informally within the community over the years, but had been consistently minimized, dismissed, or redirected rather than properly investigated. Others showed patterns of victim blaming, community pressure to maintain silence, and explicit warnings about the consequences of seeking outside intervention. Investigators also documented evidence of what appeared to be systematic suppression of complaints when they did arise. Multiple witnesses described incidents where concerns about inappropriate behavior were brought to community leaders, only to be told that they were mistaken, that they were causing trouble for their families, or that such matters should be handled internally rather than reported to outside authorities. This suppression appeared to be reinforced by both formal and informal sanctions against anyone who challenged established patterns of behavior. The investigation revealed that Pitcairn's isolation had created unique vulnerabilities that made systematic abuse both easier to perpetrate and harder to detect or report. The absence of independent institutions meant that potential victims had no access to teachers, counselors, medical professionals, or other mandated reporters who might recognize signs of abuse and take appropriate action. The absence of anonymity meant that any attempt to seek help would immediately become known throughout the community, with potentially serious social and economic consequences for the victim and their family. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation documented how Pitcairn's romantic mythology had been weaponized to discourage reporting and investigation. Community leaders allegedly used the island's reputation as a unique paradise, its special relationship with Britain, and its status as a tourist destination to argue that outside intervention would destroy the community's special character. Victims and their families were reportedly told that reporting abuse would bring shame to the island, destroy its reputation, and ultimately harm everyone who lived there. This manipulation was particularly effective because it contained elements of truth. Pitcairn's economy depended heavily on its romantic reputation, its appeal to tourists and researchers, and its special status within the British Commonwealth. Any scandal that challenged the island's image as a harmonious community of descendants from noble mutineers would indeed have serious consequences for everyone who lived there. This created a form of collective hostage-taking, where individual victims were made to feel responsible for the welfare of the entire community. By 2004, when investigators had completed their evidence gathering, they had documented patterns of alleged systematic abuse that they described as among the most extensive they had encountered in any single community. The evidence would ultimately support 55 criminal charges against 7 defendants, representing approximately 1/3 of the island's adult male population at the time. But documenting the crimes was only the first challenge. The next phase would involve the unprecedented task of conducting fair trials on an island where normal legal procedures simply couldn't apply, where defendants included essential community leaders, and where the very act of prosecution threatened to destabilize the social fabric that made life on Pitcairn possible. September 2004 marked one of the most extraordinary deployments of colonial justice in modern British history. A flotilla of vessels carrying 3 judges, 4 prosecutors, 3 defense attorneys, court reporters, security personnel, and supporting staff made the 4-day journey to Pitcairn Island to conduct trials that would test fundamental assumptions about sovereignty, jurisdiction, and the reach of British law in the 21st century. The logistics alone were unprecedented. Pitcairn had no courthouse, no jail, no secure facilities for conducting sensitive legal proceedings, though court officials had to construct temporary facilities, establish secure communication systems, and create procedures for handling classified documents and witness testimony in a community where privacy was virtually impossible. The island's entire governmental infrastructure would need to be supplemented or replaced for the duration of the proceedings, since several key officials, including the mayor, were among the defendants. On September 29, 2004, formal charges were read against 7 Pitcairn residents in what would become known as the Pitcairn Islands sexual assault trial. The defendants included Mayor Steve Christian, the island's political leader and direct descendant of bounty mutineer Fletcher Christian, his son Randy Christian, Dave Brown, Len Brown, Dennis Christian, Jay Warren, and Terry Young, names that represented the core family lines that had governed Pitcairn for over 2 centuries. The charges were comprehensive and serious. Steve Christian faced 6 counts of rape and 4 counts of indecent assault, allegedly committed between 1964 and 1975, when victims were as young as 10 years old. Randy Christian faced multiple sexual assault charges. Dave Brown, Dennis Christian, Len Brown, Jay Warren, and Terry Young faced various combinations of rape, indecent assault, and gross indecency charges. Collectively, the 55 charges represented a systematic pattern of alleged abuse spanning 3 decades and involving multiple generations of victims. The defense strategy focused immediately on jurisdictional challenges. Defense attorneys argued that Pitcairn Island had never been properly incorporated under British law, that the island's unique history as a settlement founded by mutineers created special legal status, and that London had no authority to prosecute crimes committed by Pitcairn residents under what they claimed were local customs and traditions predating modern British legal systems. This jurisdictional argument was not merely technical. It represented a fundamental challenge to the nature of British sovereignty over its overseas territories. If successful, the defense position would have established that remote British territories could claim exemption from British law based on historical circumstances, geographical isolation, or cultural differences. The implications extended far beyond Pitcairn to other British territories, worldwide, and to the broader question of how colonial relationships operate in the modern era. The prosecution countered with detailed constitutional analysis, demonstrating that Pitcairn had always been subject to British sovereignty, and that the Pitcairn Constitution explicitly established British legal authority over the island. They presented evidence that island residents had consistently sought British protection, used British passports, accepted British financial support, and acknowledged British authority in multiple contexts over many decades. The prosecution argued that defendants couldn't selectively reject British law while continuing to benefit from British citizenship and protection. The trial proceedings revealed the practical impossibilities of conducting normal legal procedures in such a closed community. Jury selection was impossible because potential jurors were related to either victims or defendants, often both. Instead, the proceedings were conducted as bench trials with experienced judges making determinations of fact and law. Witness testimony had to be carefully managed because many witnesses lived within walking distance of defendants and faced realistic concerns about retaliation or social pressure. Security arrangements were unprecedented. The temporary court facilities were secured around the clock, with restricted access and classified document handling procedures normally reserved for national security cases. Witness protection involved relocating some individuals to other parts of the island or arranging for testimony via secure video links from other countries where witnesses now lived. The evidence presented during the trials included detailed witness testimony, documentary evidence from the extensive investigation, and expert analysis of community dynamics that had allegedly enabled systematic abuse. Prosecutors methodically presented case after case, building a comprehensive picture of patterns of behavior that had persisted across multiple generations of island residents. Defense attorneys challenged both specific evidence and broader prosecutorial theories. They argued that cultural differences had been misinterpreted, that consensual adult relationships had been mischaracterized, and that the prosecution was imposing contemporary legal standards on historical behavior that should be understood within its original cultural context. They presented their own expert witnesses on Polynesian cultural practices and argued that some of the behavior in question represented traditional customs rather than criminal activity. The trials lasted several weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and extensive legal arguments about jurisdiction, evidence, and cultural interpretation. The proceedings were complicated by logistical challenges, including communication problems, transportation difficulties, and the constant awareness that the entire future of Pitcairn's community hung in the balance. On October 25, 2004, the court delivered its verdicts. 6 of the 7 defendants were found guilty on multiple charges. Steve Christian was convicted of 5 rapes and additional sexual assault charges. Randy Christian, Dave Brown, Dennis Christian, Len Brown, and Jay Warren were all convicted on various charges. Only Terry Young was acquitted on all charges, though the court noted that the evidence against him had been substantial, and the acquittal was based on technical legal standards rather than factual innocence. The sentencing phase revealed the practical impossibility of normal criminal justice procedures on Pitcairn. The island had no prison facilities, no rehabilitation programs, no alternative housing for convicted offenders. Imprisoning 6 men would have removed 1/3 of the adult male population from a community that depended on every resident for basic survival functions. The court had to balance justice for victims with the practical reality that destroying Pitcairn's social infrastructure would harm innocent residents, including children and elderly individuals who had played no role in the alleged crimes. Sentences ranged from community service to imprisonment, with most defendants receiving terms that could be served through work programs and supervised release arrangements that kept them on the island but under close monitoring. Steve Christian received the longest sentence, 3 years imprisonment, and was immediately removed from his position as mayor, creating a constitutional crisis about legitimate governance on the island. But even as the Pitcairn trials concluded, the legal battle was far from over. Defense attorneys immediately filed appeals challenging every aspect of the proceedings, from jurisdiction to evidence to sentencing. These appeals would work their way through New Zealand courts, British appeals courts, and ultimately to the Privy Council in London, Britain's highest court for colonial legal issues. The appeal process would take 2 additional years and would ultimately test whether the Pitcairn verdicts could survive scrutiny by the British legal system's most senior judges. The fundamental question remained: did Britain have the authority to prosecute its own citizens for crimes committed on British territory, even when those citizens claimed cultural exemption and those territories were among the most remote places on Earth? The immediate aftermath of the Pitcairn trials created unprecedented challenges for a community that had never confronted the systematic removal of its leadership structure. With Mayor Steve Christian imprisoned and 5 other men serving various sentences, the island faced a governance crisis that threatened its basic ability to function as an organized society. The conviction of key community leaders meant that essential roles, from municipal administration to technical maintenance to emergency response, suddenly had no qualified personnel to fill them. The British government's response was swift but complicated. Emergency administrators were deployed to Pitcairn to maintain basic governmental functions. But these officials faced the delicate task of managing a community that was simultaneously traumatized by the revelations of systematic abuse, angry about outside intervention, and practically dependent on some of the very individuals who had been convicted of serious crimes. The social fabric that had held Pitcairn together for over 2 centuries had been irreparably damaged, and rebuilding would require unprecedented external support. Victim support services presented particularly complex challenges. The small size of Pitcairn's population meant that traditional approaches to trauma counseling and victim advocacy were impossible to implement. There was no way to provide confidential counseling services when counselors, victims, and community members all lived within walking distance of each other. There was no way to create safe spaces for victims when their abusers' families controlled essential community functions. There was no way to ensure ongoing safety when perpetrators would eventually be released back into the same small community where their victims continued to live. British authorities worked with New Zealand social services to develop hybrid support programs that combined on-island interventions with off-island resources. Counseling services were provided through secure video links to trained professionals in New Zealand and Australia. Victim advocacy was handled by specialists who could travel to Pitcairn for extended periods, but who had no personal connections to island families or political structures. Financial support was provided to help victims and their families relocate off-island if they chose to pursue educational or economic opportunities elsewhere. The infrastructure improvements required for ongoing oversight were extensive. British authorities constructed the island's first proper detention facility to house offenders serving sentences on island. They established secure communication systems to enable regular monitoring and reporting to outside authorities. They implemented new administrative procedures that required external oversight of key decisions and regular auditing of community finances and governance decisions. Perhaps most significantly, authorities implemented comprehensive child protection protocols designed to prevent future abuse. These included mandatory background checks for any adults working with children, regular visits by qualified social workers from New Zealand, and requirements that any concerns about child welfare be reported immediately to off-island authorities rather than handled through traditional community decision-making processes. The legal precedent established by the Privy Council's 2006 decision to uphold the convictions had implications extending far beyond Pitcairn itself. The ruling definitively established that British law applies to all British territories, regardless of their geographical isolation, historical circumstances, or cultural claims for autonomy. This precedent affected other British overseas territories and clarified the relationship between colonial authority and local customs throughout the modern British Commonwealth. Educational initiatives were implemented to help community members understand legal standards, appropriate boundaries, and reporting procedures for concerns about abuse or inappropriate behavior. These programs faced the challenge of changing cultural norms that had persisted for generations, while respecting legitimate aspects of Pitcairn's unique heritage and traditions. The goal was to preserve the community's positive cultural elements while eliminating the power structures and social norms that had enabled systematic abuse. The economic impact of the trials was severe but ultimately manageable through increased British financial support. Tourism to Pitcairn virtually disappeared for several years as the island's romantic reputation was replaced by international media coverage of the abuse trials. The honey and craft sales that had provided important supplemental income were similarly affected by negative publicity. British authorities compensated for these losses through increased direct financial support and development aid focused on creating alternative economic opportunities. Population dynamics changed dramatically in the years following the trials. Several families chose to emigrate permanently, seeking educational opportunities for their children and economic opportunities that weren't available on Pitcairn. The island's population, which had hovered around 50 people for decades, dropped to fewer than 40 as residents sought fresh starts elsewhere. This emigration was partially offset by recruitment efforts that brought new residents to Pitcairn, individuals and families with no connections to the historical family networks that had dominated island life. The integration of new residents represented a fundamental shift in Pitcairn's social dynamics. For the first time in over 2 centuries, The island's population included individuals who weren't descended from the original bounty mutineers, who had no family connections to established power structures, and who brought outside perspectives on normal social relationships and community governance. This diversification helped break up the closed social networks that had enabled abuse while introducing new skills, perspectives, and cultural norms. Long-term monitoring systems were established to ensure ongoing compliance with child protection standards and legal requirements. Regular inspections by qualified social workers, educators, and legal officials became routine parts of island life. These inspections were designed to be supportive rather than punitive, focusing on maintaining standards and providing assistance rather than seeking violations or problems. The psychological recovery process for the community as a whole required specialized intervention by professionals experienced in collective trauma and community healing. The revelation that systematic abuse had been occurring for decades, that community leaders had been perpetrators, and that many residents had either been unaware of or complicit in covering up serious crimes created complex emotional challenges that affected virtually everyone on the island. Community healing initiatives included group counseling sessions, conflict resolution processes, and structured conversations about rebuilding trust and establishing new social norms. These programs had to navigate the reality that victims, perpetrators, their families, and bystanders all had to continue living together in an extremely small community where avoiding each other was simply not possible. By 2010, approximately 6 years after the trials, Pitcairn had achieved a measure of stability under its new governance and oversight systems. The population had stabilized around 40 residents, including several new families who had relocated to the island. Child protection protocols were functioning effectively, with regular monitoring and no reported incidents of abuse. The community had developed new leadership structures that included both long-time residents who had demonstrated commitment to legal standards and newer residents who brought outside experience and perspectives. The economic recovery was slower, but ultimately successful. Tourism gradually returned as media attention shifted away from the trials and toward Pitcairn's efforts at community rebuilding. New marketing efforts emphasized the island's natural beauty, unique history, and commitment to child safety, rather than the romantic mythology that had previously attracted visitors. Craft sales and honey production resumed with quality improvements, supported by development aid and technical assistance. Most importantly, a new generation of children was growing up on Pitcairn, with access to proper education about appropriate boundaries, legal rights, and reporting procedures. These children had regular contact with outside authorities, access to confidential support services, and assurance that any concerns they raised would be taken seriously and addressed appropriately. The cycle of silence and normalization that had enabled decades of abuse appeared to have been permanently broken. The Pitcairn trials established legal precedent that extends far beyond one small island in the Pacific Ocean. The Privy Council's 2006 decision to uphold the convictions created definitive constitutional law clarifying the relationship between British sovereignty and territorial autonomy throughout the modern Commonwealth. The ruling stated unequivocally that British law applies to all British territories, regardless of their geographical isolation, historical circumstances, or cultural claims for exemption from metropolitan legal standards. This precedent has practical implications for millions of people living in British overseas territories worldwide. From the Falkland Islands to Gibraltar, from Bermuda to the British Virgin Islands, territorial governments can no longer claim that local customs, geographical isolation, or historical autonomy provide exemption from fundamental British legal protections. The principle established in the Pitcairn case, that distance is not a defense and culture is not a shield, now governs colonial relationships throughout the British system. The legal doctrine established by the Pitcairn trials also influenced international law regarding the responsibilities of sovereign nations toward their remote territories and isolated populations. Other countries with similar territorial relationships studied the British response to develop their own policies for ensuring legal protections reach their most remote citizens. The case became a reference point in international discussions about human rights enforcement in isolated communities and the balance between cultural autonomy and universal legal protections. Beyond its legal significance, the Pitcairn case provided unprecedented insight into how systematic abuse operates in closed communities and what conditions enable predatory behavior to persist across multiple generations. Researchers in sociology, criminology, and community psychology have studied the Pitcairn case extensively to understand the mechanisms through which isolation, concentrated power, and cultural mythology can create perfect conditions for systematic harm. The research has revealed that the conditions that existed on Pitcairn, extreme geographical isolation, high levels of genetic relatedness, concentration of authority in small family networks, romantic mythology that discourages outside scrutiny, and economic dependence that makes challenging authority costly, are unfortunately not unique to Pitcairn. Similar conditions exist in various forms in religious communities, rural settlements, indigenous reservations, corporate company towns, and other closed social systems worldwide. The policy implications of this research have influenced how authorities approach child protection, abuse prevention, and community oversight in isolated populations. The Pitcairn case demonstrated that traditional approaches to abuse prevention, relying on community reporting, local authority figures, and voluntary compliance, simply don't work in closed systems where potential perpetrators control the very institutions that are supposed to provide oversight and protection. Instead, effective protection requires external oversight, independent reporting mechanisms, regular monitoring by qualified professionals who have no personal connections to local power structures, and systematic rotation of authority to prevent the concentration of unchecked power in small groups of related individuals. These lessons have been applied to improve safeguarding in boarding schools, residential facilities, military units, research stations, and other institutional settings where traditional oversight mechanisms may be compromised. The media coverage of the Pitcairn trials also revealed how romantic mythology can be weaponized to suppress legitimate concerns about harmful behavior. For over 2 centuries, Pitcairn had been portrayed in popular culture as a paradise, populated by noble descendants of mutineers who had created an ideal society beyond the corrupting influences of modern civilization. This mythology made it difficult for outsiders to believe allegations of systematic abuse and provided powerful leverage for suppressing internal dissent. The case demonstrated how stories about isolated communities, whether they involve religious groups, intentional communities, survivalist settlements, or other alternative social arrangements, can become tools for avoiding accountability rather than genuine descriptions of social innovation. The popular appeal of stories about people who reject mainstream society and create their own rules can make it difficult to recognize when those alternative rules enable systematic harm rather than positive social experimentation. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and researchers working on isolated communities have used the Pitcairn case as a reference point for developing more critical approaches to community storytelling. The case highlighted the importance of independent verification, external oversight, and skeptical analysis of claims about community harmony or cultural uniqueness, particularly when such claims are used to discourage outside scrutiny or intervention. The technological changes that have occurred since the Pitcairn trials have created new possibilities for preventing similar situations in the future. Satellite internet, video communication, social media, and other digital technologies make it much more difficult for communities to maintain the complete isolation that enabled abuse on Pitcairn to persist, undetected for decades. Modern communication technologies provide potential victims with access to support resources, reporting mechanisms, and outside perspectives that simply weren't available to previous generations of isolated populations. However, the Pitcairn case also demonstrated that technology alone is not sufficient protection against systematic abuse. The fundamental requirements remain the same: independent oversight, external accountability, rotation of authority, and systematic protection of vulnerable individuals regardless of their geographical location or cultural context. The long-term outcomes on Pitcairn itself provide both hope and caution for other communities dealing with similar challenges. The successful implementation of external oversight, child protection protocols, and governance reforms demonstrates that even deeply entrenched patterns of harmful behavior can be changed when there is sufficient commitment to systematic intervention and ongoing monitoring. However, the process required enormous resources, sustained commitment from external authorities, and fundamental changes to social structures that had persisted for over 2 centuries. The transformation of Pitcairn was possible only because of its unique legal status as a British territory, which provided clear authority for intervention, and its small population, which made comprehensive oversight feasible. Similar interventions in larger or more complex communities would face exponentially greater challenges. The ethical questions raised by the Pitcairn case continue to influence discussions about cultural autonomy, colonial relationships, and the universality of human rights. Critics have argued that the British intervention represented cultural imperialism, that outside authorities imposed metropolitan values on a community with legitimate claims to cultural distinctiveness, and that the trials destroyed a unique social experiment in favor of conformity to mainstream legal standards. Supporters counter that universal human rights protections must take precedence over cultural claims, that systematic abuse of children cannot be justified by appeals to tradition or autonomy, and that the British government had legal and moral obligations to protect all its citizens, regardless of their geographical location or cultural background. This debate reflects broader contemporary discussions about multiculturalism, religious freedom, indigenous rights, and the limits of cultural tolerance in diverse societies. The Pitcairn case provides a concrete example of how these abstract philosophical debates play out in practice when cultural autonomy conflicts with fundamental human rights protections. The ultimate legacy of the Pitcairn trials may be the demonstration that accountability is possible even in the most remote and isolated circumstances, that systematic abuse can be exposed and addressed regardless of how long it has persisted or how thoroughly it has been normalized, and that legal protections can reach the edges of the map when there is sufficient commitment to ensuring that geography does not determine access to justice. For the victims who finally saw their experiences acknowledged and their abusers held accountable, the trials represented vindication of their decision to break decades of silence, despite enormous personal and social costs. For the broader, community of abuse survivors worldwide, the Pitcairn case demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems of harm can eventually be challenged and changed when individual courage combines with institutional commitment to justice and protection of the vulnerable. The Pitcairn Island trials ultimately teach us that isolation is not innocence, tradition is not justification, and distance is not a defense against the fundamental human obligation to protect children from systematic harm. What began as a single 15-year-old's decision to press charges became a comprehensive examination of how closed communities can enable predatory behavior and a definitive legal ruling that no corner of the British Commonwealth exists beyond the reach of justice. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the communities we romanticize and the stories we tell ourselves about human nature, social organization, and cultural autonomy. For over 2 centuries, Pitcairn Island served as a powerful symbol in popular imagination, the ultimate expression of human freedom from corrupting institutional constraints, a place where noble rebels had created paradise through self-reliance and community cooperation. The reality revealed by Operation Unique was far darker, a closed system where concentration of power, genetic isolation, and cultural mythology had created perfect conditions for systematic abuse to flourish unchecked for decades. The legal precedent established by the Privy Council's 2006 ruling extends far beyond Pitcairn itself. The decision that British law applies to all British territories, regardless of geographical isolation or cultural claims for autonomy, now governs colonial relationships throughout the modern Commonwealth. From the Falklands to Gibraltar, from Bermuda to the British Virgin Islands, territorial governments can no longer claim exemption from fundamental legal protections based on distance, tradition, or local custom. But the case's broader significance lies in what it reveals about the conditions that enable systematic abuse in any closed community. The factors that made Pitcairn vulnerable: extreme isolation, concentrated authority, high levels of relatedness among residents, economic dependence that makes challenging power costly, and romantic mythology that discourages outside scrutiny, exist in various forms throughout modern society. Religious communities, boarding schools, residential facilities, corporate towns, military units, and other institutional settings often display similar characteristics that can enable predatory behavior when proper safeguards are absent. The research generated by the Pitcairn case has influenced child protection policies worldwide. The case demonstrated that traditional approaches to abuse prevention, relying on community reporting, local authority figures, and voluntary compliance, simply don't work in closed systems where potential perpetrators control the very institutions supposed to provide oversight. Effective protection requires external oversight, independent reporting mechanisms, regular monitoring by qualified professionals with no personal connections to local power structures, and systematic rotation of authority to prevent unchecked power concentration. The technological changes since the Pitcairn trials have created new possibilities for preventing similar situations. Satellite internet, video communication, social media, and digital technologies make it much more difficult for communities to maintain the complete isolation that enabled abuse to persist undetected. Modern communication provides potential victims with access to support resources, reporting mechanisms, and outside perspectives that weren't available to previous generations in isolated populations. However, technology alone provides insufficient protection against systematic abuse. The Pitcairn case demonstrated that fundamental requirements remain unchanged: independent oversight, external accountability, rotation of authority, and systematic protection of vulnerable individuals regardless of geographical location or cultural context. These protections must be actively implemented and maintained. They don't emerge automatically from technological capability or good intentions. The successful transformation of Pitcairn following the trials provides hope that even deeply entrenched patterns of harmful behavior can be changed through systematic intervention and ongoing monitoring. The island's population has stabilized under new governance structures that include both long-time residents committed to legal standards and newer residents who bring outside perspectives. Child protection protocols function effectively with regular monitoring and no reported incidents of abuse since implementation. A new generation of children is growing up with proper education about appropriate boundaries, legal rights, and reporting procedures. But this transformation required enormous resources, sustained commitment from external authorities, and fundamental changes to social structures that had persisted for over 2 centuries. The intervention was possible only because of Pitcairn's unique legal status as a British territory, which provided clear authority for intervention, and its small population, which made comprehensive oversight feasible. Similar interventions in larger or more complex communities would face exponentially greater challenges. The ethical questions raised by the Pitcairn case continue influencing discussions about cultural autonomy, colonial relationships, and human rights universality. Critics argue that British intervention represented cultural imperialism, that outside authorities imposed metropolitan values on a community with legitimate claims to cultural distinctiveness. Supporters counter that universal human rights protections must take precedence over cultural claims, that systematic child abuse cannot be justified by appeals to tradition or autonomy. This debate reflects broader contemporary discussions about multiculturalism, religious freedom, indigenous rights, and cultural tolerance limits in diverse societies. The Pitcairn case provides a concrete example of how abstract philosophical debates play out when cultural autonomy conflicts with fundamental human rights protections. The ultimate resolution, that protection of vulnerable individuals must take precedence over cultural claims when the two conflict, has influenced policy discussions worldwide. For documentary makers, journalists, and researchers, the Pitcairn case highlighted the importance of critical analysis when covering isolated communities. The popular appeal of stories about people who reject mainstream society and create alternative rules can make it difficult to recognize when those alternatives enable systematic harm rather than positive social innovation. The case demonstrated the need for independent verification, external oversight, and skeptical analysis of claims about community harmony, particularly when such claims discourage outside scrutiny. The media coverage also revealed how romantic mythology can be weaponized to suppress legitimate concerns about harmful behavior. Pitcairn's portrayal as paradise populated by noble mutineer descendants made it difficult for outsiders to believe abuse allegations and provided powerful leverage for suppressing internal dissent. This pattern appears in coverage of various alternative communities, religious groups, and intentional settlements, where appealing origin stories can mask contemporary dysfunction. The ultimate lesson of the Pitcairn trials may be that accountability remains possible even in the most remote circumstances, that systematic abuse can be exposed and addressed regardless of how long it has persisted or how thoroughly it has been normalized. The case demonstrated that legal protections can reach the edges of the map when there is sufficient institutional commitment to ensuring that geography does not determine access to justice. For the victims who finally saw their experiences acknowledged and abusers held accountable, the trials represented vindication of their decision to break decades of silence, despite enormous personal and social costs. For the broader community of abuse survivors worldwide, the Pitcairn case demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems of harm can eventually be challenged and changed when individual courage combines with institutional commitment to justice. The transformation of Pitcairn, from a place where systematic abuse persisted, unchallenged for decades, to a community with effective child protection protocols and external oversight, proves that change is possible. But that change required breaking through layers of silence, challenging entrenched power structures, overcoming geographical obstacles, and maintaining sustained commitment to protection of the vulnerable, even when such protection was costly and difficult. As we reflect on this complex story of harm revealed and justice pursued, we're reminded that our obligations to protect children and vulnerable individuals don't stop at the water's edge, don't pause for cultural considerations, and don't yield to romantic mythologies about noble isolation. The price of freedom from oversight is often the freedom to harm those who cannot protect themselves. The Pitcairn trials teach us that truly civilized societies ensure their protective institutions reach everyone under their care, regardless of how far those people live from the centers of power, how small their communities might be, or how compelling their stories of independence and self-reliance. Distance, in the end, proved no defense against justice. Culture proved no shield against accountability, and isolation, rather than providing freedom from corrupting outside influences, had instead provided freedom from the oversight and accountability that protect the most vulnerable among us. The lesson resonates far beyond one small island in the Pacific. Wherever power is concentrated, wherever oversight is absent, wherever vulnerable people depend on those who might harm them, the conditions exist for systematic abuse. Only constant vigilance, external accountability, and unwavering commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves can ensure that geography never again becomes a barrier to justice.